She should have hated him. Every reason the war had ever given her said she should turn away, lock the door, and let fate decide the rest. Instead, she did something so unexpected that an entire American patrol fell silent before a single word was spoken. One piece of bread, one impossible choice. And decades later, a gray-haired veteran would still say that it wasn't the bread that saved him. It was the person willing to share it. The question was never why she helped an enemy. The real question was why she still believed kindness was worth risking when almost everything else had already been taken from her. By the spring of 1945, her village no longer looked like a place where tomorrow belonged to anyone. Chimneys stood without roofs. Garden fences leaned at tired angles. Empty flour sacks fluttered from broken windows whenever the wind crossed the narrow streets. Anna Keller was 22 years old, the daughter of a village baker who had spent his entire life believing that bread was more than food. Before he died during the final winter of the war, he had told her something she could never forget. If someone is hungry, feed the hunger before you judge the person. Those words stayed with her every morning as she scraped together the last handfuls of rye flour hidden beneath loose floorboards, mixing them carefully with boiled potatoes to make enough dough for a single small loaf. It was never enough to satisfy anyone, but each dawn she lit the old brick oven anyway, refusing to let the fire disappear from the only place in the village that still smelled like hope. Most mornings, the smell of fresh bread drifted only a few yards before the wind carried it away through empty streets. There were no customers waiting outside the bakery anymore. No children pressing coins into warm hands. No laughter rising with the steam from cooling loaves. Anna worked in silence, brushing flour from the worn wooden table as though the next customer might still walk through the door. Upstairs, her mother rested beneath patched quilts, her strength fading with every passing week. The small loaf cooling beside the oven represented an entire day's effort and nearly all the food they had left. Even so, Anna wrapped it carefully in a clean linen cloth instead of slicing it. She could not explain why. It simply felt wrong to eat before the day had fully revealed what it might demand. Outside, church bells remained silent, but another sound slowly replaced them. The distant rumble of engines rolled across the hills, growing louder with every minute. Villagers stepped cautiously onto porches, saying nothing as they watched a column of American vehicles approach the square. Nobody waved. Nobody ran. Fear had exhausted itself long before hope returned. Among the soldiers sat Private Thomas Walker, 26 years old, his dusty uniform carrying the miles of a war that seemed endless. He studied the quiet village through the truck window, expecting cold stares, locked doors, and faces that would never forgive the uniform he wore. He had no reason to believe this morning would be different from any other. The convoy rolled to a stop without ceremony. Engines fell quiet one by one until the only sounds left were birds somewhere beyond the orchards and the soft ticking of hot metal cooling beneath the afternoon sun. Thomas stepped onto the road and stretched stiff muscles that had forgotten what a peaceful morning felt like. The village seemed to be holding its breath. Curtains moved slightly behind dusty windows. A bicycle leaned against a stone wall as though its owner expected to return at any moment. Nothing looked abandoned, yet nothing truly felt alive. The platoon spread through the square with calm discipline, checking wells, speaking quietly, offering cautious nods to anyone willing to meet their eyes. Then Thomas noticed something different. A thin ribbon of pale smoke drifted above a small brick building near the end of the street. It was the only chimney still working. The smell reached him a second later. Fresh bread. Warm, earthy, unmistakable. For an instant, he was no longer standing in Germany. He was 12 years old again, racing into his mother's kitchen in Wichita on a Saturday morning while a loaf cooled beside the window. The memory disappeared as quickly as it had arrived. Hunger, however, remained. He had skipped breakfast after giving part of his field ration to an older refugee family the evening before. He said nothing to anyone, but his legs suddenly felt heavier than his pack. Across the street, Anna watched him from behind the bakery window, quietly noticing the way his eyes lingered on the cooling loaf rather than anywhere else. Anna stood beside the cooling loaf for a long moment, her hands resting lightly on the linen cloth. Upstairs, she could hear her mother coughing through the thin wooden floor, each cough a quiet reminder that every slice mattered. Outside, American soldiers moved through the square with measured caution, speaking in voices too distant to understand. She looked back at the bread, then toward the window where the young soldier had paused only moments before. His face had not carried anger or triumph. It carried the same weary hunger she had seen in neighbors returning from empty fields. Before she could change her mind, she wrapped the loaf, opened the bakery door, and stepped into the afternoon light. Several villagers froze where they stood. An American corporal noticed her immediately, his hand rising in a silent signal that caused nearby soldiers to stop walking. Every eye followed the small bundle she carried against her chest. Anna kept moving at the same steady pace until she stood a few feet from Thomas. Neither of them spoke. She unfolded the linen cloth with careful hands, revealing the warm loaf between them. Then, without hesitation, she broke off a small piece and ate it herself. She chewed slowly, swallowed, and looked directly into his eyes before extending the larger piece toward him. The silence that followed seemed to settle over the entire village, as though everyone present understood they were watching something far greater than the sharing of bread. Thomas did not reach for the bread immediately. He looked at the small piece she had already eaten, then back at her calm expression. The simple gesture had answered every question his training had taught him to ask. There was no trap, no bargain, only an offer that seemed almost impossible in a place where everyone had so little. Slowly, he accepted the loaf with both hands, as though it deserved more respect than an ordinary meal. The crust was still warm against his fingers. When he broke off a bite, the crackle echoed softly through the silent square. Fresh rye, a hint of potato. Nothing about it was luxurious, yet it tasted richer than any field ration he could remember. He closed his eyes for only a second before swallowing. "Thank you," he said quietly, then searched his memory for the only German word he had learned from an elderly neighbor back home. "Danke." His accent was uneven, but the effort was genuine. Anna answered with a faint nod, saying nothing. Words were unnecessary. Around them, the tension that had gripped the village began to loosen. One American soldier lowered his binoculars. An older villager finally stepped out from behind a gate. Even the breeze seemed gentler as it carried the smell of fresh bread through the square once more. In that ordinary afternoon, suspicion gave way to something neither side had expected to find so soon: the first fragile thread of trust. That evening, the village settled into an unfamiliar quiet. No alarms echoed through the streets. No hurried footsteps disturbed the fading light. Thomas remained near the old well with the rest of his platoon, but his thoughts kept returning to the bakery at the end of the road. He remembered another kitchen thousands of miles away, where his mother would leave an extra chair at the dinner table during the hardest years of the Great Depression. "You never know who might need a meal," she used to say while placing another slice of homemade bread beside an empty plate. As a boy, he had never questioned her. Only now did those words return with unexpected clarity. Across the village, Anna trimmed the last crumbs from the wooden table and carried a small cup of tea upstairs to her mother. She quietly admitted that she had given away most of the day's loaf. Her mother looked at her for a long moment before offering the faintest smile. "Your father would have done the same," she whispered. The room fell silent except for the ticking of an old clock that had somehow survived the war. Outside, evening sunlight washed the broken rooftops in soft gold, making cracked stone and shattered brick seem almost gentle for a few fleeting minutes. Neither Anna nor Thomas could know it yet, but both were remembering lessons learned long before the war, lessons that had survived where so many other things had not. Those quiet memories had begun to build a bridge that neither language nor politics could have created. The next morning began with the sound of buckets striking stone at the village well. Overnight, word had quietly spread that the American soldiers had caused no trouble. They had asked permission before entering homes. They had shared water before taking any for themselves. The fear that had ruled the streets only a day earlier no longer disappeared when boots echoed across the square. Thomas spent the morning helping an engineer inspect the old hand pump that supplied water to most of the village. Rust had frozen its gears months before, forcing families to carry water from a stream nearly half a mile away. Anna watched from the bakery doorway as the soldiers removed bent bolts, cleaned worn metal, and worked without demanding anything in return. When Thomas struggled to understand an elderly farmer pointing toward a cracked underground pipe, Anna quietly stepped forward. Her careful English filled the silence that gestures could not. Within minutes, Confusion became cooperation. The repair took most of the afternoon, and when clear water finally flowed into waiting buckets, no one cheered. Instead, relieved smiles passed quietly from face to face. Children laughed for the first time since the convoy had arrived, splashing cold water across their hands. Thomas caught Anna's eye from across the square. Neither waved. Neither spoke. They simply shared the brief understanding that trust was rarely built through grand speeches. More often, it arrived one small act at a time, almost too quietly to notice until it was already there. On the third day, a supply truck arrived carrying crates of canned food, blankets, and medical kits. The platoon gathered in the square while their lieutenant reviewed how everything would be distributed. Every family would receive enough to last several days, but the inventory was limited, and every decision mattered. Thomas stood quietly near the truck until he noticed Anna waiting at the back of the crowd with her mother beside her. Neither of them stepped forward. They simply waited for everyone else to be served first. When only a few crates remained, the lieutenant handed Thomas an extra field ration that had been set aside for the patrol. Thomas looked at the sealed package, then at the small bakery where the smell of fresh bread had first reminded him of home. Without a word, he placed the ration back into the crate marked for civilians. Another soldier glanced at him, hesitated for a moment, then quietly added his own unopened coffee packet beside it. No orders were given. No speeches were made. One by one, other hands followed. A can of soup, a bag of dried beans, a bar of soap. Small things, each hardly noticeable on its own, until the crate was suddenly full again. The lieutenant watched the silent exchange, closed the lid without saying a word, and simply nodded once. Across the square, Anna lowered her eyes for a moment, understanding that kindness had quietly found its way back to the people who had first offered it. Years passed, and the village slowly learned the sound of ordinary life again. The bakery windows were repaired first, then the roof. Then the faded wooden sign above the door was carefully painted by hand until it looked almost new. Every morning, warm bread once again filled the street with the familiar scent that had survived even when hope nearly had not. One autumn afternoon nearly 30 years later, a gray-haired American man stepped quietly through the bakery door, carrying a small paper bag instead of a military pack. Time had softened his face, but not the memory that had brought him across an ocean. Anna recognized him before either of them spoke. They smiled with the quiet ease of people whose most important conversation had happened long ago without many words at all. Thomas reached into his pocket and unfolded a faded piece of linen, carefully preserved for decades. It was the same cloth that had once wrapped a single loaf on a frightened afternoon when strangers had chosen trust instead of fear. Anna touched the worn fabric gently, and for a moment neither of them looked at the other. They looked at the old brick oven where another loaf was beginning to rise. Outside, children laughed as they hurried home, carrying fresh bread beneath their arms. Wars had changed maps, governments, and generations, but one simple act of kindness had quietly outlived them all. Bread filled an empty stomach for a day, but compassion could nourish a human heart for an entire lifetime.